Hey guys, it's Jessica here. As you guys all know, I've been living in the Philippines for quite a while, although at the moment, I am staying here in Korea. Since I grew up in the Philippines ever since I was really young, like when I was 9 years old. The country of the Philippines itself is just like a home to me. The Philippines is a huge part of me, so my identity of now would never be the same without the Philippines being a part of it. Of course, there are some parts in the Philippines that I don't really appreciate or like, just like how I feel about my own country, Korea. And ultimately, I think that is because in general, I just have so much affection and love and care for the country, so I always try to be aware of the current social issues that the Philippines is facing, and I also try to engage or participate in different social or cultural activities in the Philippines as much as possible. On the other hand, as I said, the Philippines is basically like a home to me, and when I say home, it's a place where I feel the most comfortable, safe and secured. However, for many other Koreans who have never been to the Philippines or who don't know much about the Philippines, they have the exact opposite impression, which is that the Philippines is dangerous. It's not safe, and it's a country that they are scared or afraid of going to or traveling to or living in. Why is that so? In fact, how I know this is because as I meet different people here in Korea, to introduce myself, I have to mention the Philippines. And the first thing that they say, like most of them say, when I say I'm from the Philippines or I grew up in the Philippines, they're like, isn't it so dangerous there? And I can't even count how many people have said that to me in my life. This is partly because how the Korean media portrays the Philippines or issues that took place in the Philippines that is very relatable to Koreans. There are obviously several different news or content about the Philippines out here in Korea that gives the country a positive impression, especially when it comes to tourist destinations like Cebu or Palawan, Boracay, and fruits like bananas, mangoes, etc. There are also quite negative issues that is more shocking to many Koreans. Well, as you all know, sometimes what triggers or moves people more are bad news rather than good news. So for today's video, let me share with you guys some of the biggest happenings that took place in the Philippines that was very shocking for many Koreans. So the two major news that I am going to be sharing to you guys were hugely reported here in Korea, like in depth, through one of the most famous and trusted educational TV program, 그것이 알고 싶다 and PD 수첩. Some of you may be very familiar with these news because it was reported not only in various news outlets here in Korea, but also within the Philippine local news as well. So the first one took place in Pampanga back in October 2016, where 3 South Koreans were found dead at a sugarcane field. All 3 of them were businessmen and women from Korea who escaped to the Philippines because they could not afford to repay the investment amount. At the end, there were 2 suspects that were arrested, and they were also Koreans. And the investigation found that the case may be tied to a dispute with a South Korea-based businessman over money. The amount of money that was involved in this whole incident was astronomical. Because of how serious this issue was, actually, the South Korean government sent an investigative team to the country, so the Philippines, and they actually also participated in the whole investigation. So in that 그것이 알고 싶다 program, you can actually see them interviewing one of these suspects. And there were lots of drama in it where the suspect escaped from the prison, in the local prison, several times. So this news indeed was definitely very shocking for me and for many Koreans, and also for many Filipinos. The next news that I would like to introduce to you guys is also a big one that happened at the same year, 2016, in same province, Pampanga. Pampanga, or Angeles to be specific, is where the biggest Korean community is in. In fact, there is actually a Koreatown in there that I've been to for more than 2 times. There are really, really good Korean food in there, a lot of Koreans, a lot of Korean businessmen in there. This is the incident where Filipino police officers kidnapped and killed a South Korean businessman who went missing. And according to the Foreign Ministry, there were 3 Filipino police officers who were involved in this incident. So what exactly happened is that a fake arrest warrant was allegedly used by the kidnappers to force Ji Ik-ju, the victim, to come with them under the pretext of a drug-related investigation. And Ji Ik-ju's wife has said that the abductors kidnapped him in a bid to extort a ransom. By the time, she has already paid 5 million pesos, but the kidnappers wanted another 4.5 million. The victim's remains were allegedly cremated in a crematorium operated by a former police officer. So this issue was actually really very shocking for many Koreans. Even me, I was so shocked. And I know the Philippine police chief also formally made an apology because of this issue. And this type of crime method that's done by the police officers in the Philippines is very well known in Korea. There's actually a term for it. We call it setup 범죄. The Korean embassy in the Philippines even made a whole post about it to educate Koreans in the Philippines to be careful because we are foreigners in the country, so we don't know much about the police, we don't really know much about the inner social system in there. There are several ways of committing this type of crime, setup crime. As I said, the most common one I would say would be possession of illegal firearms and drugs. So the police would intentionally hide those in the target's car or house or something and act like they just found it and, oh, you are arrested. If you want to get out, just give me money. And apparently this also happened a lot in the airport where the police officers checks our luggage, especially years ago. Now it's much less, according to my dad, who have been going back and forth to the Philippines for quite a while, 13 years ago, he had been doing that. So he really kind of sensed the changes happening in the airport. So there are various ways to commit this setup crime done by the corrupt police or public officers. So recently, there was another victim to this setup crime who received the judgment of being not guilty, so innocent. He was accused by the police for possession of illegal firearms, and he was actually imprisoned for 4 months. Back in 2018, apparently all the legal process of investigation and finding proof and everything took really long. Also because of COVID-19, his sentence was released late, which was in 2020, December 28, that he was innocent, not guilty. So those 3 are just some of many other incidents that involves Koreans that happened in the Philippines. So the first news is a little different because it was a crime that was actually done by a Korean in the Philippines. But that's also what many Koreans are afraid of because when you go abroad, there are different Koreans and there is always a Korean community. And what they usually say is that you have to be cautious of your own fellow Korean when you're abroad. That's usually what they say, and I think the first news really kind of gives a good reason for that saying. And the second and third one, usually committed by the corrupt public officers, it's very daunting. This is something very scary. Even me, as a Korean, if I have never been to the Philippines and I don't know anything about the Philippines, I would be afraid to go to the Philippines because of that. I understand where they are coming from. However, does that mean that all Koreans in the Philippines have to go back to Korea because the Philippines is dangerous? That is also a no. Because I've been living in the Philippines for very long. I think it's really case by case. And for me or my family is also very interested in the country of the Philippines instead of just the touristic or the light, shallow part of it that everyone else knows. And once you know all of them, once you're just aware and very conscious of every single thing that can happen to you, I think it's safe. It really depends. It's really case by case. I think we could compare this situation where some foreigners who don't know much about the relationship between South Korea and North Korea, they think South Koreans are very, very in danger. There can be a war happening tomorrow, so we should always be ready and everything. But me, I'm a Korean living in South Korea. I'm not okay, I have to be really scared and alert. So I think it's a difference in perspective and experience and exposure. These issues, I think, is something that both Filipinos and Koreans have to really think about and reflect on, because what we always seek for is positive connection. And that's what my channel is for, honestly. And in order to foster something positive between two parties, you have to respect each other. And in order to respect each other, you have to understand each other first. Should have more interest to even the sad or dark side of each country's, I think. And instead of just bashing it, I think it's also important to have the behavior to want to learn more about it. Why is that so? Why is this happening? You always dig down to the root of the problem. You will never be able to fix a problem without digging deeper into its core. Just because it sounds complicated, just because it feels like it's not really my business, escaping it or being ignorant about it, I think is the worst attitude to have in this society. So I think it's very important that we stay engaged in all these issues, whether it's bad or good, and always strive for a positive connection between the two countries. Alright guys, so that was it for today's video. I'm actually a little pressured to film this video. I am very curious to know what your thoughts on. Please let me know your thoughts on it in the comments down below, and I'll see you guys in my next video. Bye bye.